live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about the episode A Private Little War. Now, in a lot of Star Trek episodes in the original series, there are connections to the Vietnam War. I've talked about some of them in previous episodes of this series, but this is probably the most direct dealing with the Vietnam War, to the point where Kirk and McCoy even discuss the Vietnam War and the Korean War, which is slightly an odd reference considering that there are centuries of time since that's happened, and we know that a lot of the records of Earth's history for the late 20th century were supposedly lost during the eugenics wars in the 1990s. So it seems a bit weird that was their sort of go-to comparison. But for the people of 1968, when this episode premiered, makes perfect sense. So, what's the premise of A Private Little War? Well, Initially, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy go to this planet that Kirk had led his first survey mission on, and he had become friends with one of the locals, a guy named Tyree. So they've gone back basically to just sort of see how the planet's doing, see what's up, check out the sitch. And they find that this civilization that previously had just had things like spears and bows and arrows, and had lived peacefully with one another, has now very rapidly developed flintlock muskets with which the villagers are killing off the hill people. The hill people are Tyree's people, so Kirk is naturally on their side. But logically, it seems unlikely that within a decade or so, this planet would go from sort of Stone Age type civilization to or early Iron Age, maybe. It's not real clear. Up to flintlock muskets, which are a reasonably advanced type of gun, even though in the show they say that flintlocks would be the first type of guns they would develop. Logically, that's not true, but I'm not going to take issue with that. So, Tyree is now leader of the Hill People. Spock gets shot, so he's basically out of action. Kirk and McCoy go back down to try and figure out what the heck's going on here, and if there's some kind of cultural interference from the Klingons, because there's a Klingon ship that shows up, and the Enterprise is basically like staying out of their sight. What they find out, a couple of important things. One, they find out that Tyree's wife wants Tyree to get muskets and fight the villagers. And two, that the Klingons are indeed supplying the villagers with these muskets, basically to take over the planet, kind of? Is a weird sort of... It's not the thing that Klingons normally do, right? Because Klingons normally sort of go in and say, all right, this planet is ours. Anybody that resists us, we will kill you. Whereas here what they're doing is a sort of proxy thing, where it's like, we're going to let one group on this planet destroy the other group and take over, and then we're going to run the group that won. Which I guess is less work for the Klingons, but it's, again, not really the way that Klingons tend to operate, as far as we can tell. Yeah, they sometimes make alliances and things like this, but basically they are a conquering empire. So, Kirk has to sort of figure out what to do about this. And ultimately, the solution that he lands on, Tyree's wife wants wants the Enterprise to give them more advanced weapons. McCoy wants them to figure out some sort of solution that's going to involve not having a massive civil war engulf this entire planet. And what Kirk settles on is a kind of middle solution where the Federation will supply the Hill people with the same technologies that the Klingons are supplying to the villagers. So basically, this is going to be an extended civil war, and because Kirk's decision on behalf of the Federation, which incidentally doesn't really seem to involve contacting any of his superiors in the Federation to find out if what he's doing is even okay, Kirk's solution is basically, we will preserve the balance of power, with the balance of power being civil conflict. Whether or not this is a good thing to do is an interesting question, and it is kind of the dominant ethical question of the episode. Tyree initially is not really that keen on fighting. He believes in peace, but when his wife gets killed, actually, interestingly enough, trying to trade Kirk's phaser to the villagers, Tyree agrees to fight. So, it's a Vietnam War parallel, obviously. I mean, again, Kirk and McCoy directly talk about it, and what McCoy argues is, because both the US and the Soviets, or the communist Chinese, supplied their own side, the side that they backed, with weapons, with troops, whatever it was, these wars dragged on and on and on. And that's true. That's a legitimate point. At the same time, what Kirk argues is that in order to maintain the balance of power, and in order to sort of prevent one side from wiping out the other side completely, both sides had to give their supporters exactly the same type of weapons. Is this a compelling ethical argument? In my judgment, no. In part because this ignores the idea that peace could be reached. It settles on civil war as the status quo is not only acceptable, but even the desirable outcome. And it settles on that to the extent that it forgoes even the idea of peace negotiations as a primary operating position. It also, and I think this is one of the ways in which the Vietnam War comparison actually breaks down. One of the differences here is that you have the hill people who are largely peaceful, who have vastly inferior technology, who are being slaughtered ruthlessly by the villagers with their advanced technology for the purpose of stealing the hill people's stuff, basically. That's not the situation in Korea or Vietnam. I mean, so both North Korea and North Vietnam, North Korea was always more autocratic than North Vietnam was, but these countries, so the Korean example is a little bit harder, I think, because stuff that happens much later with North Korea and the incredible repression that goes on in that country sort of hinge things. But especially with the Vietnam War, I think this is much easier to sort of get a sense of. North Vietnam was not trying to wipe out the population of South Vietnam. There was no even real pretense that this was some sort of genocidal slaughter to acquire resources or something like that. This was an attempt to reunify the country under a particular type of government. And it was a government that was generally quite popular in the North, as far as I know. And it was a government that was actually supported by a large number of people in the South. I mean, the Viet Cong was an effective fighting force of South Koreans, or of South Vietnamese, who supported the communist North. This wasn't a group of pacifists being attacked for their stuff by a more technologically advanced group. This was probably going to have been a civil war, but the fact that both the USSR and the US, or NATO, sort of intervened really escalated this conflict and made it much more violent than it otherwise likely needed to be. Was that a good thing? I don't think so for Vietnam. I think for the nation of Vietnam, I think it was a remarkably bad thing. What it was based out of was geopolitics. The country of Vietnam and the people of Vietnam became pawns in an international game where the US and NATO competed against the Soviet Union and communist China. It was about, and again, there was this idea in the US of like, we have to prevent dominoes falling. It was called domino theory, basically. If South Vietnam falls to communism, then Cambodia will fall, Laos will fall, all of these other countries will fall, and the communists will take over the world. And that was the concern. It was not really that, like, oh, the South Vietnamese are so peaceful and they're living under a government that they enjoy and they're just like chilling out, doing whatever. That was not really the reality. The South Vietnamese government was quite repressive, quite autocratic. There are the famous pictures of Buddhist monks immolating themselves in protest of the South Vietnamese government's policies because they were an oppressive government. But they were an oppressive government that was anti-communist and was backed by the US and NATO. And so they served a function for US imperialist interests in the same way that North Vietnam, I think I said South Korea there. No, I've been talking about Vietnam this whole time. The Buddhist monks in South Vietnam immolated themselves because the government of South Vietnam was a relatively repressive government, but aligned with the US and NATO. In the same way, the communist government in Hanoi under Ho Chi Minh was a reasonably repressive government. I don't think they were as sort of autocratic and violent and statist as some place like the Soviet Union under, say, Stalin, but they were still very comfortable using governmental force to achieve their political ends. And that's problematic. But this was not an incident of, here's a group of peaceful people just living harmoniously and happily, and then all of a sudden this ruthless aggressor comes along, which is what we have in the episode. And so in that sense, the analogy kind of breaks down, although in 1968, many people in the US probably would have seen it that way, probably would have seen the Vietnam conflict that way, or been willing to look at the Vietnam conflict that way, as the ruthless communist menace trying to take over peaceful and democratic South Vietnam, even though in reality that was not the case, particularly. Again, it was a communist government that emerged from a revolutionary anti-colonial movement in the north versus an autocratic nationalist government that emerged from an anti-colonial movement in the south. And it got transferred into a sort of partisan system, or a proxy war, basically. What was important in Vietnam was not necessarily, from the perspective of the global powers, the actual fate of Vietnam or the Vietnamese people. What was important was that the other side's ideology didn't win out. And I think that's the problem with A Private Little War, is in contrast to much of Star Trek's sort of commentary on the Vietnam War, which is typically very critical of the Vietnam War, this episode kind of says the only solution to the problem is to have a proxy war in which everything continues to become more and more violent, in which the people who are actually here get used as pawns in our conflict with the Klingons. And that's excused because the Hill people are peaceful in this. So that allows that ethical position to make sense in a way that doesn't really map onto the Vietnam War. And again, it's problematic because that implicitly is used to justify the violence of the Vietnam conflict and the US's military intervention in Vietnam. And I'm not convinced that Kirk makes the right ethical decision here, in much the same way that I'm not convinced that the US had any legitimate interest in going into Vietnam and fighting there.